Alright guys, we've got another video on the NDIS because it is very important. I'm going to keep talking about it. So I have clips of an interview done by the ABC with Linda Reynolds, and then there's also an interview with the CEO of the NDIA, Martin Hoffman, but we'll get to that. I'll jump in after each question and response to add my commentary because all of this really gets under my skin. Let's go.
This week, the federal budget allocated an additional $13.2 billion over 4 years to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And you are being accused of catastrophising over claims of the scheme blowing out. What's your response to that?
Well, my first responsibility as the Minister for the NDIS at quite a pivotal time for the scheme is to make sure that this scheme endures, not only for the 450,000 Australians who are now participants in the scheme, but also for the 80,000 who we think are still to join the scheme. So to make sure that this scheme endures, and to endure, it has to be financially sustainable, and we have to find a way for sustainable growth for the scheme. So for me, it's all about the participants and making sure that this scheme endures.
Okay, first of all, catastrophising. Good choice of words. And second point, when I say something like, see what they did there, or something along those lines, I really need people to understand and keep in the back of their mind that this isn't the politicians doing, like it's not their thinking. They're not that smart. This is probably talking points and teams of people coaching them on what they got to say and remember to say. Oh, and just to be clear, being willing to do this is what makes you an awful person. You don't need to be the mastermind behind it. Playing your part also guarantees that you're a shit human. And with that said, did you see what she did there? She's asked, how do you respond to making a big deal about how much the NDIS will cost? And then Linda Reynolds is like, I just want to make sure it can endure, like it can last for a long time for a lot of people. Alright, we have a lot to get through, so moving on.
Talked about sustainability. Some people in the disability community are worried that they either won't get onto the scheme at all, or if they're already in the scheme, that their plans will be cut. What do you say to them?
Look, there is no plan to indiscriminately cut or to cap plans. But what we do need to do is introduce, for example, independent assessments, because in the last 6 weeks I've been consulting extensively with participants, with their families, with their providers, and with a wide range of stakeholders. And it is very clear to me that apart from putting the program on a sustainable growth trajectory, we have to make the scheme far better for participants themselves. So what I've heard so far is that under the current legislation, which was introduced in 2013 and hasn't really been significantly changed since then, is that there's a number of unintended consequences. So what participants have been telling me is that going for an annual assessment every year and having somebody from the NDIA going through line by line and having to adjust their plans line by line is unpleasant, and I think it's probably not necessary. So one of the things I'd like to do this year is introduce legislation that increases the time between reassessments by the NDIA, but also if we've got independent assessments in, we can then make sure that there's equity in the packages between participants.
Alright, there's a lot there. First of all, how she quickly snuck in indiscriminately.
There is no plan to indiscriminately cut or to cap plans.
And secondly, alright, the constant assessments for funding would obviously become annoying, but I don't know about her plans to make the time between assessments longer, but we will discuss that more because there are more questions asked to her and Martin Hoffman about independent assessments. I just want to draw attention to what I find the most concerning out of what she said here, which is making the plans more equitable between everybody. Because every time they talk about making the plans like equal, it really just screams that they do not understand disabilities.
Well, you've just talked there about independent assessments, and when you first got into the role, you put a pause on the introduction. Is it an actual pause though?
It is a pause. Independent assessments were always anticipated, and in fact they were in the original legislation. They're common, and in fact, I think just about all insurance schemes have an independent assessment process to provide that consistency and fairness in packages of support, and that was in the legislation. And I think it is one of the deficiencies that we don't yet have that in place to actually determine what is reasonable and necessary.
During the making of this, I had a realization. How can you need to introduce independent assessments when everyone's getting assessed every year anyway?
The disability community wants to work with you says it wants to work with you on this. The relationship between the former Minister, Stuart Robert, and the disability community was broken. What are you doing to repair that relationship?
Well, I certainly wouldn't characterise it that way, and my predecessor made a lot of significant changes and a lot of important changes for this scheme, and was incredibly passionate about the scheme. But I certainly did. I have spent 6 weeks so far, and I've got a number of weeks still of consultations to do. But it was very clear that there is a lot of people in the community disability sector who are angry and who are concerned. So my role is to listen, and I've heard a lot, but then to work through with the sector on how we fix it.
Oh, and this question. It's like Linda, she wasn't asking you what the relationship was like. She was telling you that it was broken. Oh, and how are you going to fix it? Oh, I'm going to keep going to those briefings and getting told those.
What do you have to say when you hear people refer to what you're planning as robo-planning?
Well, look, on that term, that's not a term that I'd use at all, and I don't think it's right, and I don't think it's helpful. Let me talk about what we're actually trying to do here, because let's not forget as well that many people would say that the current way planning works is not working particularly well either, and I would agree with that. Just think about what's happening now. We are increasingly building an ever more complex rule book of what we will fund and what we won't fund, and when we'll fund it and when we won't. And, can you have carers on Sundays or not, and how many hours? And what will those carers do? And do we fund dance lessons or not? Do we fund singing lessons or not? Do we fund Thermomix appliances or not? And so on and so on. And each of those decisions is something being made by one of my staff. And so each plan has come down to hundreds of decisions, yes, no decisions, ever more complex rules being decided by a public servant. And that's not choice and control. It's not the way the scheme was meant to be. It's not personal budgeting or turning the funding around from going to the provider to going to the participant. It's making planning into begging and bargaining on a line-by-line basis, and us trying to make decisions, as I said, about hundreds of different issues that people want or think they need, etc., or need in a way that's very hard to do efficiently, quickly, consistently across Australia, and so on. So what we're really trying to do here is three things. We're trying to have a scheme that gives the right amount of money overall to each participant. So that's our fundamental task as an insurance agency, to decide and agree the right amount of money for each participant. And then, having said that, to allow the participant to the greatest extent possible, make their own decisions about how they use it, because they are the experts in their own lives. So let them and their family, their carers, make those decisions. So a much less extensive rule book on what we will and won't fund, because we've got the overall amount right to start with. And then the third thing is, in order to do those two things, an overall right amount of money flexible use of that money, we have to have consistent, reliable, free to the participant information to make those decisions. And that's where independent assessments come in. So that's the sort of scheme we want to deliver. I think it's a much better scheme, more in keeping with the objects and the principles and the ethos of the scheme from 10 years ago than the very complex line-by-line thing we've got now.
Great question. Bringing attention to the fact that this plan has been called robo-planning, and we should all know what it means when something's called robo-anything in Australian politics. It's not good. It is not good. And second point, yes, that's why he's CEO. Martin Hoffman really did help me understand what their intentions are with the NDIS. So the reason they have to get rid of any specialists involved in the process, you just can't have informed people involved. And then if you do get on to the NDIS, after going through an independent assessment, you'll get given what seems to be a predetermined sum that you just got to make work for you because they have to have it equal. And third point, I know I'm not the only person that found it really concerning when he was like, do we fund carers on Sundays? Alright, we have a lot to get through, so moving on.
I help us to understand why you chose the term independent assessments.
Well, really, the term goes back to what the Productivity Commission wrote in 2011, where they made reference to exactly that. And they quite straightforwardly said in that report that the information that those decisions should be made on should be obviously accurate and reliable, but needed to be independent of the participant and their current treating professionals who may have an ongoing relationship with them. So that's the concept. What's in a name? I'm certainly not hung up on calling them independent assessments. As I said, what I really want is a scheme that's based upon reliable, consistent, free to the participant information that we can make those funding decisions on, so that participants can get on with their lives with the minimum amount of sort of NDIA bureaucracy.
It's like, really, the Productivity Commission said that the best thing for the NDIS is to remove consultation with specialists. I find that very hard to believe. I find that extremely hard to believe. Get rid of specialists and replace them with these independent assessments. Now, we're going to break down independent assessments a bit more with the questions that are asked. I think the host of this podcast does a great job, so we'll move on.
Because I've been through the independent assessment process, and what sort of struck me was, that this person that was doing the assessment, was essentially being paid by the NDIA. So I'm like, are they really independent? That's kind of like, a bit of an issue. And the other element for me was like, they didn't know me from a bar of soap. And the complexity of my needs are very hard to, capture via a stranger who hasn't had the history of knowing me. So I just feel like that there is a real benefit from having practitioners involved that know the person and that can really give the agency a clear understanding of what that person's needs are. And I think that might get lost in the changes. What do you think of that?
Well, so I just go back to systems all over the world, including in Australia, where you're having to make a decision about, to be upfront about it, to make a decision about the allocation of funds, use tools and information supplied by somebody separate to the person who is receiving them. That's what the Productivity Commission said. It's the way a range of other compensation and insurance schemes work today across Australia and around the world. Now, what matters then is, do we get the amount of money right? And then that's really when planning starts. And that's when people who do know your circumstances or participants' circumstances really come into their strength, because we then start talking about, you start talking about how best to use that money for your own particular goals, your own particular life aspirations, your particular needs, etc. But we've got to have a consistent, reliable, standard way of making that resource allocation decision, that funding decision, when it comes down to it, across 500,000 people now.
So the host points out something very interesting, the fact that the independent assessments are indeed conducted by people that are still paid by the NDIS. So he questions how they are independent, and it goes back to how it's just a name chosen for it. Yeah, well, robo-planning is another name. Anyways, when Dr. George continues to share his experience with the independent assessments, he points out that the person doing the assessment doesn't really know him and won't be able to fully understand his needs. And even after sharing his personal experience and explaining how specialists being involved is a pretty important aspect, Martin Hoffman trying to tell people that getting rid of the experts is how you're going to make better decisions. And he's doing a good job at helping me understand what their intentions are here. Because you see, before with your NDIS plan, you'd work out what you needed funded, and then they would work out if they can fund it for you. And now it seems like you're going to get given a budget and you're going to pay for what you need out of that and just hope you have enough. And it's really gross, because I think the way they're trying to sell it to people is, oh, you have freedom to finally get what you need. You just need to keep it within budget. And I can't help but think of that 23-year-old that needed a seizure mat. All right, we got to move on before I get too angry.
Do you think there could be a role for practitioners who know the person in informing the assessment process?
Well, one of the things we're doing right now, and is through the pilot, which you mentioned, is looking at exactly these sorts of questions. The way we've done it for the pilot, as the Minister has said, won't be the way, if we go through legislation, that it's done in the future. We'll be learning from the pilot, learning from the consultation, learning from the input from the sector, from our Independent Advisory Council, from the state and territory disability advisory councils, from the disability representative organisations, the peak bodies, who all have ideas about how an IA process can be improved. And certainly one of the questions is, how do we best use, or how might we use pre-existing information that already exists about the person, as well as who might do part or all of the assessment tools. In the end of the day, I said, I'm not hung up on the name. I'm not hung up on the IA process. I want the scheme with those three pillars of an overall funding amount, flexible use of it, and reliable, consistent information to make good decisions about what that funding amount is. I'm quite open to refining the way we're doing it, the way we would do it to get that information.
Yeah, and I think the three pillars are absolutely on point, and I'm glad that's how the agency has landed. The concern has really been around the how we get there, right?
Yeah.
And then to just further stress the importance of having someone's doctor involved in the process, the host comes with a follow-up question, just to be met with, we're not going to do exactly what's happening with the pilot. We're going to try and make the system as good as we can. Yeah, all right, mate, here's an idea. Maybe consult the specialists. If you want the best information, maybe go get the best information. The only reasonable thing that's come out of this Martin Hoffman's mouth is maybe using information we already have. Yeah, I think a lot of people will be a fan of that. Like, we've had to inform the government that my brother is autistic a concerning amount of times. The best idea I've heard so far. Moving on to the next part where the host brings up a very important point.
The the independent assessment process being undertaken by strangers who don't know the person, and that this results in an allocation of funding, which, from what I understand, the assessment itself, if it goes wrong, it can't be appealed. Is that right?
No, I mean, this is a really important point, George, and thanks for raising it. So two points to make here. Firstly, where that information is used for an access decision or for the planning decision, the budget decision, that decision, the planning decision, is absolutely still reviewable and appealable if the person thinks it's wrong. Absolutely. Where we get, now that's the first point, where the IA is used for a decision about planning, that planning decision is absolutely still reviewable and appealable.
All right, I'm going to quickly jump in here halfway through his answer to the question of the independent assessments being appealable. And he goes to say that the second part, the planning part, is still absolutely appealable. But aren't they trying to change it from getting things funded to being given a budget? So what, people will be able to appeal their lump sum if they don't think it's right? See, it doesn't even make sense. Their bullshit plan has so many loose ends.
The second point is really about, well, even before you get to the planning decision, how do we make sure the IA itself is giving good information, is giving that reliable and consistent information that I said we really need? And that's where I think, again, out of the pilot, out of the consultation, we do need to think about ways to have checks and safeguards that information is accurate, is giving a fair picture of the person, of their needs, of their capabilities, and then we go and use it for the decisions that we need to make. So, yes, we need to make sure there is a chance to get the information right at the start, and some form of review, some form of check or safeguard on that. And that's something we're working on with the pilot and with the consultation. And then secondly, when it comes to an actual government decision about access or about planning and funding, those decisions have got to be and will be and are reviewable and then, if necessary, appealable as well.
And he still only said that the planning part is appealable, and the first part, we'll come up with some safeguards. And there, again, he still just says that they need quality information. You want quality information, but you're going to get rid of the specialist and you're going to come up with some safeguards, but you're not going to make it repealable for people? Fuck off.
I think that's a good thing, that the funding allocation will be appealable. What does concern me, for example, is, there could be an assessor who's really not appropriately applying the assessment and does not deliver the kind of assessment that the person deserves. That process, I feel like there needs to be a way for that person to say, this happened and I need that fixed, or I need this assessment to be done again, because that assessment will be on that person's file, for the entirety of their lives. So that is a concern.
So I think, again, as I've said, we've got to make sure that there are checks and safeguards to get that quality, consistent, reliable information I spoke about. And there's a range of ways we can do that, including in terms of the training and control and oversight of the people doing the assessment. I think, don't forget, we've got a system now where we get a whole range of information, often inconsistent, often from a range of different people. And that information is being used today, of course, to make funding and planning decisions. And we know that there is at times a lack of quality in those decisions, a lot of variation and inconsistency. And so having a consistent standard set of information to make those decisions is intended to improve just that point that you're making, George.
This Martin Hoffman guy is really trying to sell that getting rid of the experts is somehow going to equal better decisions made. It's like he really doesn't understand that it doesn't matter how much training someone gets, you're not going to really be able to tell someone's needs after 3 hours with them and asking a bunch of questions and ticking some boxes. And this is the second time he's mentioned that the system currently has its issues. It's like, no shit. If it was running smoothly, it'd be a lot harder convincing people to send you in to make changes, wouldn't it? Only reason you're there is because it has issues, and what are you going to do? You're going to make everything a lot fucking worse, aren't you? Alright, moving on to the next question. Now, the host uses an example of someone living with their family and someone living in a group home as why people might need different funding because of their different circumstances. And this is the response that he gets.
What do you think in terms of the need to fund people to achieve what they want to achieve?
Sure. So this is also a very important area. The starting point is that goals don't drive the amount of funding. And that's true today and has been true from the start. Funding enables the pursuit of goals, but you don't get more money by putting more goals in the plan, or you shouldn't, because that just becomes, where's the end to that? So that's always been the case, and that'll continue to be the case. More goals, bigger goals, doesn't mean more funding as compared to somebody in the same circumstances. But you're absolutely right. Where you're in those sort of life transitions and moving out of a group home or moving out of your parents' home or employment, or moving from school to not being at school and hopefully being employed in some way, those life transition stages, absolutely, and your goals around that absolutely lead to funding implications, absolutely lead to changes in funding. And so that has been the case today, and that doesn't change. But what we do make clear, as has been the case from the start, is that just putting more goals in the plan shouldn't and can't lead to automatically more funding. That's not the way the Act works today, and it won't be the way the Act works going forward.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you would understand. I wasn't implying that should be the way it works.
Exactly.
We're just thinking more about people's personal circumstances and how they, for example, if Martin, if you end up having a disability and you wanted to continue living with your family, that would require a certain kind of support package that might not reflect what someone would need if they live with 3 other people in shared living. I guess that's what I was implying.
Yeah. So those personal circumstances and life transition moments, particularly around housing, around education, around work, are absolutely drivers to the funding levels, and they have to be.
See, first he seems to not understand the question and then goes to explain how more goals doesn't mean more funding. So what does that tell us? So if someone with more goals has the same amount of funding as somebody with less goals, probably won't be able to properly fund something. if you want to keep within budget. And then the host points out that that's not what he implied and tries to get him back onto the course of individual circumstances, and how Martin even says, oh yeah, that does lead to funding implications. But then he goes on to say that people's individual circumstances does somehow infect funding. Well, how are you going to have equal funding for everyone, but their circumstances impacts how much they get funded? See, he's just honestly saying words to run out the clock. Now we'll move on to the next question.
You said that the person can decide how they spend their funding. Do you envisage any restrictions on how they can spend their funding?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things we're still working through and still consulting on and wanting input on. Clearly, if funding has been given for a very specific purpose, like supported disability accommodation, SDA, or like a expensive piece of assistive technology, it needs to be spent on that and not on something else. So, there's got to be those sorts of controls of those sorts of fixed amounts. Within that, after that, it shouldn't be spent on things which are ordinary costs of living, because the scheme is not set up to be an income supplement. It's set up to provide supports necessary for disability. And now, as we all know today, the dividing line between what's an ordinary cost of living and what's a disability-related support is hard. And that's why we get an ever bigger rule book trying to work that out. And I want to get away from that. So that means for me, there are a lot less rules about what it can be used for, and a lot less proof of what it is, because if the amount of money is right, the person's going to use it on supports that they need and to develop their capacity, etc. They're the expert in their life. They'll make those decisions. We can give support and guidance and assistance if necessary, either from agency staff, the LAC staff, or support coordinators. But we get away from a lot of this proving that each support satisfies Section 34, reasonable and necessary.
So, from what you're saying, it's a bit of a watch this space.
Well,
that we do expect.
There's a lot more flexibility. Really, the only one that I'm particularly concerned about, is this. Does it become an ordinary costs of living issue? But if we've got the amount of money right, then people will make the right decisions as they need.
All right, he's asked if there'll be any restrictions on how people use their funding, and he just condescendingly says, it has to be spent on what it's meant for. Yeah, no shit. And then he states how they have a hard time with the difference between a cost of living and a disability support. Now, I reckon I know why they have a hard time with that. It's because they don't understand that a disability support is a cost of living for people living with disability. And I got to quickly comment on how everything's meant to fit into the classification of necessary and reasonable, and working out whether they'll fund expensive pieces of technology. Even the current system, why would they not fund a seizure mat? I just keep having that run through my head.
So, Martin, before we finish up, there'll be a lot of people with disabilities and families listening to this, and there's a lot of concern and angst in the community. What would you say to people who are really concerned, and how would you help us feel like this is going to head in the right direction?
Sure.
Alright, see, now that was the question. That was the fucking question, right? Now, after all of this crap that he says, it's just pretty much stuff he's already said, he gets to this. This is part of his answer.
We do have to make sure the scheme is affordable. I don't want to shy away and not mention that. I want to be transparent and upfront. We spent a lot of money this year. We're going to spend even more money next year, $26.5 billion at least. And the numbers go up after that. But they need to go up in a way that is controllable and predictable. And at the moment, or over the last 3 years, growing at 12.5% per year per person is simply not affordable. We can't have a scheme that is growing ongoing faster than the economy, faster than the population, faster than tax receipts, faster than the ability of the parliament to the country to afford it. So having a controllable cost increase curve is what we need to do, and I'm quite honest and open about that. We need to have cost increases that are predictable, that are controllable, that are in line with the projections that the states made, and their funding goes up at 4% each year. So that is an issue we're working on, but it's in that context, getting a controllable, predictable growth curve so that the scheme is affordable for the long term. If we can do that, we can also make sure that people can use their funds in a much better way than it's been to date. We can get out of having public servants every year making line-by-line decisions about what can and can't be funded. And we can focus on the scheme delivering the outcomes that were wanted in terms of participation in the community, employment, engagement, and a different life opportunity than was the case before.
Oh, he just wanted to be transparent, had to mention the cost. Now, something dawned on me while listening to this. If there's like a 12% growth per participant, and that's going to make it unsustainable, but yet they're going through it line by line, and it's like a begging and bargaining thing to get their funding, how is that on the participant? If they're already assessed every year and it goes line by line, how is there this huge blowout of funding? You can't have both things as an issue. And then so you're going to put a cap on everyone's funding and somehow make it equal, and they're going to make it work. And that was part of his response to how he's going to make everyone feel better about it all. Okay. Now I'll wrap up this video here. All the links will be in the description box below. Thank you for watching. And to end this video, I've got one last question that I had to include because the host really comes for Martin. Absolutely nails him.
I might ask one more question there.
Fair enough. We've still got time.
Why? Yeah, maybe there's two of these. How many people with disabilities on the NDIS board?
Yeah, so honest answer to that is I'm not 100% sure. And that sounds silly. What I mean is there is no one on the board with at the moment with a visible, what we call a visible disability. There are certainly members of the board who are deeply engaged as carers and have lived experience in that sense. We also have a number of vacancies on the board, and right now the government and the minister who are responsible for the board are looking to make appointments very shortly. And I'm quite sure that replacing previous members who were people with disability will be one of the criteria in getting a balanced board. And so, as I said, there'll be announcements, I understand, by the government on new board members shortly. And then, of course, we've also got under the Act, the Independent Advisory Council, which is set up very deliberately to have a formal role in advice to the board. And of course, it has to be comprised of people with disability or with direct caring experience as well.
It's really interesting to me. I've been working in this sector for a long time, and I always find it interesting to see how poorly people with disabilities are represented on boards and on decision-making bodies. And I often think, if there was a national women's insurance agency and you had no women on it, everyone would be, there'd be an outcry on that. But yeah, we seem to have a long way to go. And in the disability sector, we say nothing about us without us. And I think that needs to apply in boards and governance.
Sure. No, and I would agree with you completely there. As I said, we've currently got vacancies on the board, and the government's actively considering the appointments of new directors now. And I know that's one of the factors that has to be got right. As I said, it's not the agencies or even the current board members' decision. That is a matter for government to make. They appoint the board under the Act.